Hallelujah. Amen. Give Abba the praise that he deserves. My goodness, we're living in a season that I believe that the prophets of old longed for. Everything that you can read in your scriptures, from the beginning of the Torah throughout the Tanakh and to the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament, in my personal opinion, was written not for those prophets, not for those individuals that were living at the time that those things were penned, but for this generation that's being raised up as we speak. And the reason for that is to enable you to become the man or the woman that Abba has called you to do in the face of the enemy, so that you can deal with the adversity, the calamity that's on the horizon, and demonstrate the majesty and the power of His Word. You believe that? Amen. If you believe that, then you should be one of those individuals that knows that sometimes change is necessary, even though it may be uncomfortable. Sometimes we have to examine our closely held beliefs and traditions and be willing to make some changes, because, to be quite frank with you, if I had not been wrong in the past, I would not be where I'm at this afternoon. And so sometimes tradition has to be exploded in the front of us so that we can see the fallacy that we may have embraced and we've been encumbered with for multiplied generations. And this is the season when those encumbrances are being broken off of us. And I don't know how you feel, but I'm so excited for what Abba's doing. The things that He's revealing, this Torah portion that we're going to look at this afternoon, entitled Yitro, Exodus chapter 18, 1 through chapter 20, verse 26. I've been in the ministry for 40 years, and this has been the most difficult teaching that I've ever approached, simply because I believe Abba's wanting to share something with you. This is not an accident that you're here. It's not an accident that you're listening live via the internet, or you may be listening to this via recording, because Abba wants to speak to you regarding the basic foundational principles that are inside this Torah portion. And what you and I are going to attempt to do this afternoon, we're going to set aside our previously held, if you will, our previously held positions, the paradigm that we've had regarding who Yitro Jethro was, what's transpiring at the particular time that Moshe is visited by Jethro at Mount Sinai. If you go back and study the Torah and you look at some chronological events, it's actually been just 7 weeks, 49 days until this event's taken place. 49 days is right on the precipice, if you will, of a jubilee, a yovel, a setting aside, a release. I believe that there's something inside this parsha this afternoon that we're going to treat that's going to cause you to have a yovel, a release in your personal relationship with Abba, and an extended release in who you are as a believer, who you represent in your household, who you represent in your community, and who we collectively represent as the body of Messiah. I'm convinced that the sole purpose for the Exodus, and you can challenge me on this if you want, but I believe that the sole purpose for the Exodus was to raise up a group of beings, a group of individuals that would be called a kingdom of priests. Well, if that's the case, I need to know how to function in both of those two roles. I need to know how to be efficient handling the kingdom principles of Yahweh, and I need to know how to function in a priestly role. A priest is one who's to mediate between Abba Father and those who are outside relationship with Him. And so what we're going to do this afternoon, we're going to look at some things, and I'm going to challenge you to set aside your previously held convictions and do what 2 Timothy 2:15 says, and study to show yourselves approved unto Yahweh, workmen that need not to be ashamed, by rightly dividing this word of truth. Amen? We're going to look at some hidden things in this parsha regarding who Yitro was, his relationship with his son-in-law Moshe. As I said, the timing of this parsha in relationship to the Exodus, where they were when Yitro appears. And by the way, when he appears at this particular time, there's something you need to pay attention to, because he's bringing Moshe's, if you'll allow, former wife with him Zipporah, and the 2 sons that they had together. And what we're also going to look at is some other things that take place at this mountain encounter at Sinai. And you're going to look at some things that will probably challenge how you've looked at who Jethro was, Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb. There's some things that have been hidden specifically until the generation that you and I are living in right now. And so what I want you to do is to, again, tell your flesh, I'm going to hear this. You hear? Could y'all hear the conviction that your neighbors had? Flesh. Yes, flesh, I'm going to hear this. Your flesh must not need to be challenged like mine does. And so I would have to do this. Flesh, you're going to hear this. All right? First of all, yeah, we want to look at Yitro, Strong's number 3503. It's usually translated as his abundance. It actually comes from an ancient root word indicating listen to this is mind-staggering, a remainder, something that's left over, an excess, something after a specific amount has been looked at, there's an abundance that's attached to it, a small rope or cord that hangs free, a residue, a bow or a harp string. I believe that Yitro probably would have been involved in praise and worship, Miss Jean. And it also indicates his name, that he's involved in preserving alive, in other words, so that there could be a group that would have more than enough. His name also comes from an ancient root that means a remnant that's left behind. That's mind-staggering. And so as soon as I look at this definition, I have to ask the question, who then is this man called Jethro? And there's some buzzwords here that you probably have listened to over the course of the weeks and months and years that you've been associated with Remnant of Truth International, Manna from Heaven Ministries. And so you have to ask yourself, what remnant then, if that's what his name is indicating, what remnant could this man Yitro possibly be representing? So let's look at this Yitro, the priest of Midian, the man. Most individuals, when they study the Torah portion, study the Bible, and most of the scholars that I looked at, and I'm telling you, I have looked, okay? This is just not a casual putting something together in order to tickle your fancy so that you'd say, oh my, that was a real good word. Yitro is usually considered a pagan priest, but was he? If you go back and look at again what the Scripture has to say about him, and that's where I want to extract my opinion is from exactly what the Torah says. And by the way, I want to qualify that by saying not the King James English. I want to go back and look and see what the Hebraic text has to say about the man. And so he is first called in Exodus chapter 2:16 as the priest of Midian, but he's initially identified as Ruel. Strong's number 7467. And when you look at that name, and bear in mind at that particular time in history, and a lot of us have been disassociated from how important names mean. Names are actually prophetic utterances. When you release a name over a baby that's to be born, you're actually prophesying the character and nature of that baby that's on the horizon. Do you hear me? And so whoever named him Ruel understood that it meant a friend of El. This is what he was supposed to become. And if you look at the root stem of the word Ruel, you have the resh ayin root that gives us the word for shepherd, ruler, or teacher. Now, a lot of people go back and look at the aleph lamed root El, or Ruel, Ra'el, and they say, well, that's simply indicating that he was a shepherd in relationship to a specific entity, not necessarily Yahweh or Elohim. However, there are a lot of other clues that we're going to uncover as we begin to look a little bit closer. But I want you to remember these quote-unquote buzzwords, and I want you to file them away in your memory because you need to be able to put this thing together and form the right kind of picture, not just what you've assumed over the course of decades and generations. Let's look at this priest of Midian, the word priest. You've heard it a million times. It's the word Kohen, and it's defined as priest, but it actually comes from, again, an ancient root that indicates one who is supposed to mediate in religious services. The ancient definition actually goes a little bit further, and it indicates an individual who stands in that office, that his purpose for standing there is to stand up on behalf or in behalf of someone else's matter and to labor in that other individual's cause. And so I have to ask you, whose cause do you suppose that this individual, the priest called the priest of Midian, would have been laboring on behalf of? Think about that for a second. Now, if you go back and look at the law of first reference, which I believe sets the foundational viewpoint for every word that we look at in the language, sometimes it may change. There may be some little nuances regarding the particular definitions. But if you go back and look at the law of first reference, in other words, where you first find a priest defined, you'll see that it usually sets in motion something regarding the office or the entity that's associated with that word. Does that make sense to you? And so if that's the case, the law of first reference gives context here regarding the original use of this title, Cohen, and it seems to infer, listen to this carefully, it seems to infer that those who follow the one that pioneered this title would also be entitled to be called Kohen. And I found it interesting that the first time you see the word Kohen used is in Genesis 14, and it's in relationship to this individual that we talk about all the time called the Melchizedek, the Melchizedek. And again, there are only 4 instances that you see this particular word used, and it's with Melchizedek, and it's with Joseph, and it's with this individual here called Midian. And then there are 2 other individuals. Those were Shemite Cohens, after the order of Shem, having had that transferred to them past the flood and on down to Shem, who I believe was literally the Melchizedek. But there were other two individuals who represented the pagan counterfeit of this thing, and we have Pharaoh and Potiphar, who was the priest of On. Now, as we look a little bit further, understanding now the title Cohen that's associated with this name Midian, then it kind of gives you a little bit more of an idea of the individual that we're trying to address. The traditional rendering of Midian is strife. Now, strife can be defined, especially when you look at it from a Western mindset, it kind of has a negative connotation. But suppose I am striving for righteousness, striving for right judgment, then it kind of sets things in a little bit different paradigm. Well, if you look at the word Midian, spelt Mem, Dalet, Yod, and Nun, the root stem, the Dalet Nun, does indicate judging, in particular, a righteous judgment. And once more, the law of first reference tells us that the first time we see this individual named Midian is in Genesis chapter 25, where Moshe, after the death of his wife, Sarah, he remarries a woman called Keturah, and she gives him 6 sons. Now, most of us have kind of relegated Keturah and all of her sons, thrown them over to the side and kind of discounted them and not paid any attention to who they are. But they still had the same father of faith that Abraham was to Jacob and Isaac and Joseph and all of the other tribes of Israel. He was a father to the sons of Keturah. Okay, now you think about that for a second. Now, Keturah, her name is usually defined, again, from an ancient Near Eastern treaty perspective, Hebraic connotations as well. Her name would have been defined as incense, the smoke of which would rise up into heavens and be sniffed, inhaled into the nostrils of the Creator during sacrificial rituals. And you have to remind yourselves that the Hebrews understood, as I said earlier, the prophetic nature of naming their offspring. And her name would not have been an accident, neither would the names of her 6 sons, one of which was called this Midian. And in my opinion, because of who their father was, there's absolutely no doubt that Midian would have been taught the Torah. Midian would have been taught circumcision. Midian would have been taught the holy convocations and everything that was ensconced in the Torah by his father Abraham. And if that's the case, we need to find out who this Midian was. And when it says that Yitro was a priest of Midian, it indicates that there was a specific location that had been entrusted to Midian, the son of Abraham and Keturah. And so we need to also look at that particular land area that was affiliated with them as well. So let's look at the location of Midian. Now, I didn't provide a lot for you here other than what I did in my notes. If I'd give you all of the background information, we'd be here for a couple of days. But let me just share with you, there is without doubt, and I can provide it to you if you will see me afterwards or email me, there is a preponderance of evidence, biblically and extra-biblically, revealed right now as we speak. We've got some good friends that spent a lot of time, years in the Saudi Arabian area, and they know beyond a shadow of a doubt where Mount Sinai, where Mount Horeb is, and they know some of the things that's going on. In fact, anybody today that's sharing with you pictures regarding the real Mount Sinai, the split rock, the mountaintop of Horeb and Sinai, they more than likely got their information from Jim and Penny Caldwell of the Split Rock Foundation. And so kudos to them. But this evidence presents the fact that the land of Midian today, as we speak, is in northwest Saudi Arabia. And it just so happens, and I'm kind of saying that sarcastically, if you will, because it's not an accident, that there exists in that vicinity of the land called Midian an Arabic town called Al-Bad, which in the ancient text was also known as Midian. And again, it just so happens right there where Al-Bad is, there's a system of ancient caves that's called Makhair Shuaib, also translated as the caves of Jethro. Well, why is this important? It's important because at this particular location, it was only a 12-mile journey as far as sheep grazing would be concerned to the mountains of Horeb and Sinai. This place called Al-Bad, where the caves of Jethro, the dwelling place of Jethro, Jethro could have stepped out of his dwelling place and been in the shadow of Mount Sinai and Mount Horeb every day of his life. Now, there are a lot of individuals out there today that adhere to the particular Catholic persuasion regarding where Mount Sinai is, and I'm going to just tell you it's not in the southern Sinai Peninsula. And along with a lot of other biblical sites, if you want to visit the land of Israel today, you need to know somebody that lives in the land that can take you to genuine, real places, not Catholic funded. And I'm just telling you that as a fact, okay? If, in fact, this Al-Bad, or the land of Midian, or the caves of Jethro was in the shadows of Mount Sinai, then we could naturally expect that Jethro must have had some kind of insight regarding the location. You don't live in a place for a long period of time without at least gleaning some understanding regarding the history of the land. Can you say amen? And it's my opinion that knowing this information helps us to understand why Moshe would have fled to this specific area and spent 40 years in the area as a shepherd. There's no other individual like a shepherd that would have had the expertise in the topography of that place like Moshe would. And isn't it ironic that he spends 40 years, quote unquote, wandering around, following the sheep, and while you're grazing sheep, you've got a lot of time on your hands, and so you can examine things. And so it's not an accident that Yahweh would then turn around 40 years later and bring Moshe and an entire nation of people back to this very same place in order to meet with him. Something, in my opinion, ladies and gentlemen, is strategically important about this place called Midian. Are you with me? Now, let's go back to the individual called Midian, the son of Abraham and Keturah. I want to submit with you, and you can go back and look at Genesis chapter 14, that Abraham was a contemporary with the one we call Melchizedek. If he was, so was his son Isaac, his grandson Jacob, and later his great-grandson Joseph. And so it's not a stretch for me. It may be for you. It probably is because tradition has caused us to set aside the sons of Keturah, okay? But it's not an accident, and it's not a stretch of the imagination for me to believe that Midian would also have known the one we refer to as the great priest, the Melchizedek. In fact, I want you to pay attention and note the parallels. Go back and look at Genesis chapter 14, and then fast forward to Genesis 18, and you'll notice this. The priest of Melchizedek, he goes out to meet Abraham. The priest of Midian comes to meet Moshe. Abraham's servant is Eleazar. Moshe's son is Eleazar. Melchizedek praises Yahweh for delivering Abraham from his enemies. Yitro praises Yahweh for delivering Moshe and the children of Israel from Pharaoh. Both individuals, the Melchizedek and Yitro, bring an offering to Yahweh and eat with their prospective hosts. And finally, just like Melchizedek, go back and look, Yitro has no lineage mentioned. Strictly a coincidence. Are you hearing me? Now, I want you to fast forward with me to Exodus chapter 18, verse 7. Bring a offering of water in the name of a prophet and receive a prophet's reward. Look at Exodus chapter 18, verse 7. And Moshe went out to meet his father-in-law. Now, some will say the events that transpire are simply because it was his father-in-law. And I think sons-in-law should respect their fathers-in-law. Say amen. Thought I'd throw that one in there. But he does something interesting here. And it says, and he did obeisance. Now, if you go back and look at the ancient history, you never find an individual bowing to another individual in this capacity unless and except it was acknowledging that they were of a higher rank or order than they are, just like Jacob and Esau. Are you hearing me? And it says he did obeisance and he kissed him, and they asked each other of their welfare, and then they came into the tent. Most of the time you overlook it. You need to go back and see what the Hebrew language says. Now I want you to hold your place there and fast forward to Exodus 33, verse 7. And it says, and Moshe took the tabernacle and pitched it without the camp. Now the terms throughout this whole exercise here are interchangeable. Tabernacle and tent are interchangeable. And he pitched it, what? The tent or the tabernacle, without or outside the camp, afar off from the camp. And he called it the tabernacle of the congregation. And it came to pass that everyone who sought Yahweh, remember this, if you had something that you needed resolved and you wanted to seek Yahweh out, you had to go speak to Moshe. You went out unto the tabernacle of the congregation, which was without the camp. Remember that, okay? Because what do we find happening with Jethro and Moshe? He finds, I know you've read the story, he finds Moshe sitting outside a tent all day long dealing with the issues of the people. Am I right? That's what you just read. Now, there are a lot of scholars, including those that provided us the text of the Targums, that believe since Moshe's found judging the people, when Jethro advises him, look, dude, you're going to waste yourself. You're going to be exhausted. Set yourself up 70 elders and let them judge some of the minor things, okay? Most scholars believe that he was sitting outside this very tent that was just alluded to, and they went inside the tent, and it was this same tent that Moshe took Jethro inside of in Exodus chapter 18, verse 7. If that's the case, Moshe understood something, because in Numbers chapter 18, no one is allowed into this tabernacle, this holy place, who is not a priest of Yahweh. Are you listening to me? So why was it that Jethro was allowed inside? See, these are the kind of questions we have to ask us. Oh, well, he violated spiritual Torah principles because that was father-in-law. I don't think so. Moshe would not have violated the Torah for anyone, in my opinion. And so based on our evidence, in my opinion, it's possible that Jethro could have also been a priest representing, remember what Midian means, what Yitro means, that he was representing a remnant of the Melchizedek order. And I want to ask you this question. Is it possible that Moshe, upon fleeing Egypt, that Moshe could have specifically went to Midian in order to be set into his role as a Melchizedek priest over Israel? Bear in mind, when Moshe flees Egypt, Moshe is already trying to reconcile the issues between his brothers, Israel, and Egypt. In fact, he takes matters into his own hand and commits manslaughter and kills an Egyptian and subsequently flees on behalf of that. Moshe knows that he has a genuine call from Yahweh. So is it possible that's the reason that he flees to the land of Midian. I submit to you that it was not an idle decision born out of chaos for Moshe. I'm convinced that Moshe made a deliberate choice. Listen to this. Not only that, but Moshe would never have married a pagan priest's daughter. So that puts Yitro in a different light again. And according to what our Catholic friends tell us, that is the current location of Mount Sinai, it is still in Egypt proper. And so if Moshe was going to flee Egypt, he would never have stayed in Egyptian territory, would he? So, even though a lot of you may dismiss this, it's an established fact that as late as the reign of Hezekiah, and Shepherd John and I looked at some information here a while back, some archaeological information that was just mind-staggering. It's an absolute fact that as late as the reign of Hezekiah, there existed two separate and distinct temples in the Jerusalem area. One that represented the Melchizedek order, and the other was located in what we would refer to as Solomon's temple. And in fact, archaeological evidence exists to prove that King David actually went to the Melchizedek place in order to worship on occasion prior to the building of Solomon's structure. Now, remember I told you in Exodus chapter 19, verse 6, that Israel was intended to be a kingdom of priests. Are you hearing me? This is before the Levitical order has been set in. Am I right? And so if they're called to be a kingdom of priests, what priestly system would they have officiated under? Because a Cohen, or a priestly sect, if you will, of Kohanim, have to mediate something on behalf of someone. Are you with me? Now, again, the Levitical order was only later set in motion after, mark that down, after the golden calf incident. And so it is also a fact, an established fact, it cannot be refuted, that Moshe functioned then as the priest of Israel until Aaron was set in his Levitical capacity. But isn't it ironic that Moshe continued even after Aaron had been set in as a high priest? Who was it that goes up and interfaces with Yahweh on every occasion? Aaron? No, Moshe. And so Moshe continues to serve as a mediator. What does a Kohanim do? A Kohen do? He is one who mediates on behalf of the people between Yahweh and the nation. And so he serves as a mediator between Yahweh and Israel, a role that was consistent with that of high priest. So let me ask you this. This was before the Levitical hierarchy was set in motion. What priestly system ordained Moshe? Were there two different priestly sects? Now, I'm going to give you what I believe my opinion justifies. There is, in one of the sages, a work of one of the sages called the Mishnah of Yomah, a discussion where a second Kohen Gadol is always prepared. The original retains, in other words, the first one always retains his role. If Moshe was the first priest, he always retained his role. And he is bound by all special laws pertaining to the Kohen Gadol. And I therefore contend that Moshe functioned in a higher capacity as the priest of Melchizedek order, while Aaron became the Levitical representative. In addition to that, we find that the Kohen Gadol underneath the Levitical order could only function after they had been consecrated, if you will, after a 7-day season of spiritual and physical consecration. Am I right? Remember that? So in order for this to be consistent, if Moshe functioned as a quote-unquote high priest, when and where did his consecration occur? See, these are the kind of questions that we have never asked, but they need to be asked because it's very apropos and it's very pertinent to where we are right now, because in the days in front of us, there is going to be serious bloodletting between the two camps, those that believe that the Levitical hierarchy, the Levitical order, and the third temple construction must be the preeminent means by which Yeshua is brought in under them, versus the Melchizedek order, which will only recognize Yeshua as the king and priest in the earth, and the shedding of his blood, not the shedding of the blood of bulls and goats. And so I'm convinced that during Moshe's time with Jethro, that they were obedient to keep the holy convocations, the Moedim. And those Moedim would have been passed down from Shem, the original Melchizedek, to Abraham and to all of Abraham's children, including the Midian. And so, therefore, if you study, how many of you are familiar with the 7 holy convocations of Yahweh? Did you know that these holy convocations provide, on 2 occasions throughout the holy year, 2 separate 7-day periods that suffice for consecration of a priesthood? Pesach and the Festival of Unleavened Bread, and Sukkot, also known as Tabernacles. It is my opinion that this kingdom of priests that we read about back there in Exodus, that these holy convocations were set there in order for us to have 2 separate occasions throughout the year for us to be set into, consecrated, if you will, as part of the eternal priesthood, fulfilling Exodus 19:6, where you would become a kingdom of priests. That's mind-staggering. Just look at the word Moedim, how it fits. It looks as if I just reached over here and picked this and reached over here. You try it. How many of you have ever put a puzzle together and you had a piece that looked like it could fit and you just stomp it in? Well, I promise you, none of this was stomped in. This is stuff that's supplied, I believe, by the Ruach HaKodesh. And if this doesn't fit, then it's not my fault. I believe it's simply because we don't want it to fit our paradigm and our tradition. The numeric value of this word Moedim is 120. And that's pretty important to us because we know Moshe lives to be 120 years, at which time I believe we're also going to be the same way. We're going to walk into the kingdom, and at 120 years old, our eye will not be dim and our natural force abated. Turn to your neighbor and tell them, I'll have some of that. All right. Now, the first time you see man's days being numbered as 120 years is back in Genesis chapter 6, verse 3. And it tells us that man's days would be numbered for 120. And it's interesting because that's actually parenthetically inserted right in the middle of a discussion of the sons of men and the sons of the fallen ones coming in and cohabitating with the daughters of men, and then a flood taking place. Remember that? There are also 120 of Yeshua's disciples gathered in the upper room at Pesach after his execution. Now, I'm convinced that the 120 years that Genesis 6:3 talks about is related to the coming of the flood. I believe when that was prophesied, it was letting us know that there would be Yahweh would tolerate what was going on and give man an opportunity for another 120 years, okay? And at the end of that 120 years, you know that the flood was going to take place, and the Nephilim and all those hosts who were contaminated by the Nephilim DNA massaging would be annihilated as well. And so it's my opinion we need to, and it looks as if this 120 was just taken and put here, but it fits because 120 is significant in the future calendar of Yahweh. How so? The Moedim were originally placed on a 30-day, 12-month cyclical calendar of 360 days. Matthew 24:22, and Shepherd John's been talking about this. He's been putting things, and we've all been looking at it for you to consider. The days are going to be shortened to the effect that the current 365-day calendar year is going to be condensed, if you will, to 360. And it's going to divide the calendar into 3 cycles of 120, 120, and 120, 360 days. When this happens, listen to me, I believe that it's going to be timed with a second great destruction of these rebellious fallen ones, and it's going to leave behind a remnant seed line safe within an ark. Are you listening? Why? Why use the illustration of an ark? Well, the ark is a shadow picture of a Goshen. In every case, I want you to listen to this because great judgment is coming on the earth. The judgment is going to be so severe that except Yahweh shortened the days, all of flesh could be destroyed. Even the elect is what it says. And so it would behoove you to find out where you need to be, when you need to be, and who you need to be with. And if that means you're going to be inside an ark, also known as a Goshen, you need to know where that's at. In every case of judgment, there has always been found a remnant of faithful inside the sanctuary that's typified by Noah's ark right there. And that remnant that was always safe inside the ark is the remnant called the kingdom priests. Hello? I would have shouted right there. Come on, y'all. I know why. Can I tell you why you didn't shout? It's because you didn't know if you was going to be in that remnant or not. If you knew you was going to be in that remnant, hallelujah! That's me. Strictly an accident that we have Remnant of Truth International. Yeah, strictly an accident. I can just hear Rochelle now. I don't understand why he gave us that name for this ministry, Remnant of Truth. Well, I'm telling you, because it was a prophetic declaration for the days in front of us. If that pattern is consistent, and it has to be, or it's not Torah, then in order for us to be extricated from Egypt or Babylon, there must also be for you and I a Goshen available that gives us sanctuary, because we are this kingdom of priests, and Yahweh has to provide a place of sanctuary for His remnant. Well, it seems to me that this land of Midian, where you find the location of Mount Horeb and Mount Sinai, that it served its purpose as a Goshen for Moshe, Yitro, and originally Midian. So let me just add another little bit of you might want to say, that's not that significant, but listen to this. Horeb and Sinai. I believe that Horeb and Mount Sinai are literally the columns, if you will, the two gateway pillars that provide the entrance to the Garden of Eden. Why do I believe that? Genesis chapter 3, verse 24 tells us that at the gate of Eden, that Yahweh placed cherubim and a flaming sword to station themselves at the gate. And the purpose of stationing themselves at the gate was to prevent Adam and Eve in an untoward carnal fleshly condition from going back and accessing the tree of life. Remember? If you look at the word cherubim and the word for sword, they're written basically the same Hebrew letters, except one has a kaf and one has a chet. They're etymologically interchangeable. And if you look at the root of the two of them, it is the same root as the word Horeb for Mount Horeb and Mount Sinai. I believe that these two twin mountains literally could have been the columns of fire that looked as if they were flaming swords stationed at the gate of Eden. Well, I don't know if I believe that. What do you think Moshe did when he saw a burning bush literally exploding in flames on the side of this mountain? Is it possible that that was an isolated event and had never happened before? Or is it possible that Yahweh was prone by time to walking up and down in the Garden of Eden like Genesis 3 tells us, and that when He would appear on the mountains of Horeb and Sinai, that the mountains would have been on fire? When the children of Israel come to Sinai, what happens to the mountains? Those mountains are on fire. Is it possible that those two mountains could have resembled two flaming swords that guarded the entrance to the original Garden of Eden? Think about it. Only a remnant's going to have access to this location. And I believe the remnant today, one of the phrases, kind of been coined for the remnant is pure bloods. Turn to your neighbor and tell them, I'm a pure blood. And let me just share this with you. I believe that if you go back and look at when the children of Israel took the blood of the lamb and applied it to the doorpost, it represents the loins and the thigh of the man. The entrance to the house represents the loins and the thigh, forming the Hebrew letter chet, if you will. Now, is it possible that the application of blood, now prior to the fall, blood was light. Blood is light slowed down. And so prior to the fall, it's very possible that fire and light would have been on top of those columns, those doorposts, Mount Sinai and Mount Horeb, signifying that this was the entrance to the gate of Eden that is now being opened. And is it possible that when Yahweh had the children of Israel to slaughter the lamb and place the blood on the doorposts of their houses, that he was telling them the entrance to Eden has now been opened to you? As we continue, it's my opinion that the remnant purebloods, those whose bloodlines have not been tainted with corrupt seed, or those who have not been vaccinated, and if you have, please, I'm not trying to be mean, I'm just telling you, if you have, you made a mistake, and there's ways that you can remedy that even now while you have a chance. Say amen. I believe that the remnant pureblood are being shown where their respective Goshen is as we speak. And if you want some information regarding that, just let us know and we'll tell you how to get in touch with Shepherd John. I believe that your Goshen lies in a mechanism that is currently being revealed that will expose the deeply rooted tentacles of Babylon. And at the same time, it's going to provide your freedom. This mechanism is going to be your Goshen. It's going to be your ark that's going to allow you to travel through the sea, S-E-A, of commerce. Once that Goshen is established, then the remnant seed will begin to physically gather together. The outcasts will be gathered together on the land in an established Goshen area. Now pay attention to this. I've looked for 3 years at this word vaccinate, and it was not until preparing for this message that I saw what I'm sharing with you this afternoon. It comes from it's a compound word from 2 Latin words. Vaca, meaning what, Ceci? Cow. And nat, meaning born or birth. The original vaccination involved the injection of what was known as cow pus, and it was found that there were maidens that were milking cows when this cowpox had just about annihilated a lot of people on the earth. These milk maidens were not subject to it, and so they found that if they would inject this cowpox into individuals, that they would have an immunity developed. And so vaccinate then can literally mean born of the cow, or the cow has saved my life. Ironically, the Hebrew word for cow is parah, as in parah adumah, the red heifer. It was the ordinance of the red heifer that was enacted by Yahweh as an atonement for the golden calf incident. And it was the golden calf incident, listen to me carefully, that set in motion the birthing of a Levitical priestly system. In other words, the Levitical, and this is going to make you mad, and I'm going to just look dead in the camera. I don't care. Okay, I just don't care. It's the truth. Literally, it is this Levitical priestly system that was born of the cow. The golden calf is what birthed this system. Now, if Yeshua fulfilled the red heifer ordinance above, the parah adumah, then why is this maniacal movement that's attempting to certify another red heifer for the third temple sacrifice service? Why is it being so hot after? Why are we doing everything we can to find these? Listen to me. They're genetically modified anyway. So they're not pure blood, pure bread either. Are you hearing me? And so that disqualifies it. Their DNA has been massaged, so that disqualifies it as well. And so wanting to return to the application of the red heifer's ashes and a third temple service is actually exposing a heart's desire to return to a golden calf system where a Levitical hierarchy is set in motion. And I'm telling you, it is not needed because Yeshua became our parah adumah, and I do not intend to attribute my rebirth to a genetically modified heifer system. I am not born of a cow. Are you listening? Now, we were talking about the Moedim, that numeric value of 120. And it's interesting because those who celebrate the Moedim, in my opinion, are, at least some of y'all, are acknowledging that the Melchizedek order sanctifies you twice yearly, and you are a pure-blood remnant of Yisrael. Go back and look at the numeric value of 120. It's the same value as the word masak, and you saw that throughout this last 3 years. We get the root mask from it, okay? You can be masked if you want to and let the enemy tell you what you're going to say and circumcise your lips according to his desires. Or you can have circumcised heart and circumcised lips and a circumcised vocabulary like Abba declared you could. Can you say amen? By the way, you can look at this next one, and I'll skip it real quick. There's actually a coding system, a clerical system, that has been established where those of you who are purebloods are being identified by the system. And so for any reason in the future, if you do need some emergency treatment at a medical facility, they can identify you as this Z28.310. You're one of those purebloods, and I seriously doubt that you will leave there a pure blood unless you do your due diligence. Say amen. So let's look at this Midian. Why was Midian at Horeb and Sinai? Well, we have previously taught that upon the divisions of the land in the days of Peleg, remember Genesis chapter 3, verse 5, and chapter 25. Excuse me, I believe that's probably chapter 10, chapter 9 or 10. And that they were divided according to their tongues and their families in their nations. And it's my opinion that the Shemites from the house of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, that the Shemites would have been given charge of the language of creation, Hebrew. The root of it is the word Ebar, or Ivrit, which means a crossing place, a place where you can cross and have sanctuary and be protected. And I believe that Ivrit was the language of Eden. And so I'm convinced that the Shemites from that time forward, after the order of the Melchizedek, would have been charged with the language of creation, the language of Eden, and the land of Eden proper. I don't believe that Eden was just an ephemeral spiritual exercise, and it was once Adam and Eve were put out of the garden that Eden was lifted up and carried into the heavenlies. I believe that Eden exists today. I believe that Eden has just been hidden from those that have carnal eyes, okay? And the reason I believe that, you're going to see in just a couple of seconds when we look at the definition of Eden and its relationship to the word Midian. Eden usually is rendered as a delight, but break the individual letters down. You have the ayin. The ayin can indicate a well or an eye as a source of waters. It can also indicate a womb, while the dalet nun indicates judgment, to plead or to litigate on behalf of someone. I'm convinced, though Adam and Eve were righteously judged because of their fall in Genesis chapter 3, you had one who came on the scene functioning in the Melchizedek priesthood called our Messiah Yeshua, that he then litigated on their behalf. Are you with me? And so Eden could have been a well or a sanctuary or a womb of judgment and litigation. Now look at this word Midian. Eden is spelled ayin dalet nun. Midian is spelled mem dalet yod nun. And it is usually, as I alluded to earlier, translated as strife or to contend, but it also has prefix to it, this letter mem, which once again indicates a well or a womb. And is it possible that you can see a connection to the land of Midian and Eden? Both a well or a womb, the place where the source of litigation occurred on behalf of someone who was in need of righteous judgment. Strictly an accident, strictly coincidental. But if you consider the mountains of Horeb and Sinai, in other words, the mountains of Yahweh, I don't think it's a coincidence. The reason for that is because the root stem of the word Horeb, sword, to cut, indicates a circumcision, While Sinai, go back and look at the original root letters of Sinai, it indicates a learned one. And I believe that it represents literally the original place of circumcision known as Eden. And by the way, the rabbis themselves teach that circumcision is literally the doorway to Eden. And I am one of those individuals that I literally believe that in the near future, when we walk into the kingdom, we are going to walk back into a literal Edenic paradise. Can you say amen? Now, I'm talking about Eden being the place of circumcision. But I strongly differ with the rabbis who contend that Adam was born circumcised, when in fact, listen to this carefully, Shepherd John and I were talking about this, Yahweh literally formed his physical body, and I want you to understand something. Adam was created to procreate with his words. Oh, I just don't believe that. Well, let me just share this with you. You can have children born from the natural now out of your fleshly loins, but you can literally speak over your children and you can form your children into what you speak over them. Adam was created to speak his sons into existence rather than through a physical sexual relationship. Look at this word. The Hebrew word yetzar for formed has a numeric value of 300. It's not an accident that another value, 300, is associated with the word arel, which means uncircumcised. Did you hear that? Come on now. So therefore, after the fall, Adam is revealed naked and in need of covering for his loins. And I believe it's simply because Adam had the Torah condensed and implanted into him. The living word of Yahweh was breathed into him. And I believe along with that was the understanding of what the Torah meant and his role. I believe Adam understood that he was to be a Messiah-like figure. And so based on that, I believe that he understood he was to represent the circumcised one. Circumcision indicating one who was cut off for his people. But yet he fails. And so what happens immediately, you find the voice who I believe, go back and look at the teaching we did a couple of weeks ago, I believe that voice was the manifest presence of Yahweh, also known as Yeshua our Messiah. And I believe that when he arrives on the scene, Adam is in need of circumcision. And I believe that Adam, just like Abraham, was probably circumcised at that particular moment in time, allowing Adam to step into a prophetic role recognized as the circumcised, cut-off flesh of Messiah, the flesh that had to die, and it would be rehearsed from that time forward in a temporary skin covering until the perfect one would come who would be born in the flesh. I'm about to share something else with you. It's probably going to cause you to strain. But is it possible that the very one who walks in the garden, and I contend that he more than likely circumcised the Adam himself, but is it possible that this manifest present Yeshua in the garden also circumcised himself or had previously been circumcised? I just don't know if I believe that. Have you ever read Revelation 13:8 that says that the Lamb was slain before the foundation of the world? The entire salvific redemption plan of Yahweh was set in motion and accomplished long before the world's foundation was laid. And I submit that he very probably could have either circumcised himself at that time. Oh, I don't know how he could circumcise himself. Abraham did. And I believe that it would have been in order to initiate the redemption through the Melchizedek order. Listen to me. The Melchizedek order and circumcision cannot be separated. And you need to understand the purpose of circumcision in order to understand why we need the restoration of the Melchizedek order. And you can't separate circumcision from the blood of the Lamb, because circumcision and Passover are one and the same, and you can't separate them. Even the rabbis acknowledge that you can't celebrate Passover if you're uncircumcised. They think about it from strictly a physical standpoint when it's really a heart issue, but it's also a physical issue as well. Oh, I don't know if the Messiah would do that. I don't know how he could do that. How many of you believe that Yeshua was also a shadow picture of Joseph, and Joseph was a shadow picture of Yeshua? The rabbis themselves teach that Joseph, in order to convince his brothers of who he was, that he revealed his circumcision to them. Is it possible, and I'm speculating here, I cannot prove this, but I believe the evidence is overwhelming. Is it possible that when you find the three Melech, the three visitors that came to Abraham, is it possible that while Abraham is sitting there on the third day, reveling or reveling, if you will, in his own circumcision, that the one who had been circumcised since the foundation of the world walked up and was able to identify himself so that he could relate to him? This is why you circumcised yourself, so that I would have a doorway opened up in the earth, so that I could come in the flesh and be cut off for all of mankind. It's powerful. If that's the case, I believe Horeb and Sinai are the mountains of circumcision, the place where the covenant of life was initiated. And it's not an accident, if this is the case, that once they leave Egypt, Israel, led by Moshe, beat a hot trail to Mount Sinai, this very exact location to meet with Yahweh. Why? They're going to meet with the circumcised one. And so circumcision, though it isn't a physical act in the flesh, the whole purpose of circumcision was a prophetic declaration that I believe that there is a Messiah coming, one who would shed his blood for mankind, and I believe that he is on his way, and I am circumcising myself in hopes of that redemption process, and I'm testifying that I believe it's coming. Anyone that says that they believe in circumcision and denies Yeshua and the blood of Yeshua, which was placed on the eternal doorposts of the house of Eden, are liars. Adam, Midian, Yitro, Moshe, all of them would have been aware of the importance of this Edenic location. And I firmly believe that circumcision was a rite that was first practiced by the Melchizedek priesthood simply for the purpose of acknowledging that Yeshua was in fact the Messiah, and I believe that it openly testified of who he was, and that I was to be an eternal representative, a Kohanim functioning in the office of the original Kohen. There's some other evidence giving reason for Midian having settled in this area. The Garden of Eden is an oasis-type environment. Adam and Eve were expelled, and from Adam and Eve's day forward, all of mankind were relegated to a nomadic existence outside Eden, always looking back in hopes of accessing the oasis. The Midianites were also desert dwellers. They were desert nomads. And their whole purpose, they camped from one place to another. Why? Because they understood the importance of the oasis and guarding the oasis and always returning back to the oasis. And they were compelled, that nation called the Midianites were compelled to search for the same. Something's going on here, and we weren't taught properly. In fact, scholars consider what I'm sharing with you the Kenite-Midianite hypothesis. But it's not an accident that this same scholarly work suggests that Moshe would have been first introduced to Yahweh while he was in Midian. I agree. Our last teaching dealt exclusively with the identity of Yahweh in relation to that of Yeshua, who I believe are one and the same. And so if you identify Yahweh, Yeshua, the circumcised one in the flesh, who was forever after the order of the Melchizedek, that introduction would have introduced and initiated Moshe into that same king priestly order. It's my opinion that the Melchizedek that was mentioned in Genesis chapter 14 would have been the great priest. And I submit to you that this very location that we're talking about in this portion this afternoon would have been the same location back in Genesis chapter 14 where Abraham returns from the slaughter of the kings and he's met by this Melchizedek. It kind of helps you understand why Melchizedek as the priest in Genesis 14 shows up as a caretaker of that particular area, as a priest in that particular area, right? By the way, that same place is also known as the Valley of the Kings. And so it would be consistent with our opinion that the land of Israel would be formed in the picture or shadow picture of a man, just like what you see here with Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. I'm telling you, Abba does not just isolatedly throw things out. I believe that Da Vinci had some divine insight regarding what took place in Genesis chapter 2 and the forming of the atom, and I'm also convinced that the two columns of Horeb and Sinai would have represented the waist and thigh area of that man, the same as where the blood was applied on the lintels of the doorposts, the procreative area of the man. Can you say amen? Let's look a little bit further with Moshe and Zipporah and Yitro. Can y'all hold on? Now, if you thought that was controversial, what we're about to do, we're going to examine the character of one of the most convoluted individuals in the Torah. The rabbis are biased in some of their depictions of this particular woman, but you'll find most of them agree. Something mysterious, there's a mystique that surrounds her like no other entity in the Torah, no other female in the Torah. Zipporah. Her name is usually translated simply as bird. How would you like to name your daughter? Hey, bird, come here. If you go back and look at the root of it, it comes from the root zafar, which means, listen, when I saw this, I was sitting on my chair. My wife will tell you, I've been having to get up about every 30 minutes. I can't stay seated. It comes from a root that means to go in a circle. Even my grandson's been going in a circle here lately. It means to literally revolve around. I know y'all are not catching this. You're real slow. It means to go in a circle, to turn yourself about. As you're turning yourself about, it means to leap and to dance, to chirp and to twitter. But it also can indicate to leave early. The Zadi Pei Resh root hints at a sharp, piercing, shrieking sound or a sharp point. From that same root, we get Zephardiah, the frogs. That same root is only seen one other place, and it's in Ezekiel 7:10, where it's translated as a circuit. In other words, you could say this: what goes around comes around. You got me? In this case, in Ezekiel, it hints at what is returning produces a gloomy set of affairs. But if you and I are looking, we know what's coming next in our Torah portion. We know that Zipporah is about to get involved in the circumcision. Am I right? Have y'all read the Torah portion? And so it's interesting because her name carries the idea of piercing something in a circular movement, just like circumcision. But it's also indicating that she's leaving the circumcision off early. She's not completing the circumcision. And so it leads to a disastrous turn of events because the circumcision's not completed. You think maybe, and again, I believe that we need to have natural physical circumcision, but if I'm not circumcised in my heart, I may have got started on the road, but that once saved, always saved junk doesn't cut it, because what you did once you go back to the wallah, back to the calf, back to the cow system, you left off your circumcision. Are you listening? Now, it's not argued whether or not she's the daughter of Yitro. But it is argued that she was the only wife of Moshe. when I contend that Moshe divorced Zipporah and marries another. In fact, most people say that she was the Ethiopian or Cushite wife that Miriam makes derogatory comments about. But let me stipulate this. Yitro is described as a Midianite. You can search all you want. You will never find the two terms, Midianite and Ethiopian, used together. They're always distinctly used in reference to two separate nations. So she could not have been a Midianite and later an Ethiopian or a Cushite. And if you go back and read the text, the language there is the same language that's used in Genesis chapter 3. She is literally put away. She is shalaked, if you will, by Moshe. Now, it's interesting because after the initial encounter with her, with Moshe that you see back at the well, she's never shown in a favorable light. So you have to ask yourself, why? So I want to look a little bit deeper into some of the conventional things it says that's said here in the text. First thing I want to look at, set aside our viewpoint regarding Zipporah for a second. But I want to find out why Yahweh threatens Moshe. Has anybody ever stopped and just asked that? Why, no, I ain't never thought about that. I just read the text. Well, if you understand what's about to happen here, I believe it'll help you to discover why Yitro is later going to try and return Zipporah to Moshe in our Torah portion. So if you don't stop and ask why Yahweh tries to kill Moshe, or it looked as if, then you'll never understand if she was divorced and later attempted to be brought back. Y'all get that? Now, if you go back and read Exodus 4:18 through 31, you find Moshe leaving Midian on his journey to Egypt with Zipporah and his two sons. If you go back and read the text and a lot of ancient commentaries, it seems that Yahweh is upset with Moshe for not circumcising his sons, specifically Gershom in this instance, who was the firstborn. Now, Gershom is translated as a foreigner, stranger, or an exile, one who's in exile. Gershom is actually a foreshadowing of this generation today. We've been called strangers, foreigners, and we've been in exile. Okay? Now, it's my contention that Moshe would never have overlooked the ritual of circumcision. Neither would, now pay attention, don't misquote me here. I don't believe he would have ever overlooked circumcision, and I don't believe Yitro would earlier. Why? Because Yitro would have had direct insight from what Abraham had said to Midian and Midian on down, because he was a priest of Midian. Midian was entrusted with the things that Abraham had taught him, okay? So what's the deal here? I submit to you that it wasn't whether they were circumcised or not, but more than likely how it was done. And when I started looking at this, it completely exploded my previous viewpoint, and I've taught on this extensively in the past, and I don't mind telling you, I believe I was wrong. Now, some of y'all can't say that, but I've been wrong before. I wouldn't be here if I hadn't been wrong before. And it's being able to admit that you've been wrong and accept the truth, even if it shatters your closely held traditions, that'll get you into the kingdom. Now, again, we have extra-biblical, biblical, historical texts that tell us that circumcision, listen to me carefully, circumcision was practiced in Egypt long before Moshe's day. In fact, from at least 2400 BCE, circumcision in Egypt was a rite that was specifically associated with the priesthood in Egypt and the royalty of Egypt. You know the story. Moshe was raised in Pharaoh's house. So Moshe would have been circumcised, if he had not been circumcised by his Hebrew parents, surely by Pharaoh's house. Somebody as important as Moshe in the prophetic scheme of events that Yahweh set in motion would have not have fallen through the cracks. Something happened intentionally here. And if you want the rest of this, we'll just Would you like to know what happened? I don't know if y'all can hold on, I've got 20 slides left. The text of Exodus chapter 2, verse 2 indicates that the baby Moshe was 3 months old upon being discovered by Pharaoh's daughter. She finds him set in a basket and placed in the river Nile. Remember, the river Nile was considered the bloodstream of the Nile, of the nation. Are you with me? Now, by all accounts, he's raised by his Hebraic parents, and he should have had a Hebraic circumcision, but did he? And so in order to understand, you have to bear in mind the timing of this particular event. Go back and read chapter 1 just prior to this. Pharaoh has issued a death sentence to all Hebrew boys born at that specific time. Right? And so what she's trying to do, she's trying to protect her son, and in order to protect him, provide some semblance of future for her son. Am I right? Now, Exodus 2:6 tells us that upon finding him, Pharaoh's daughter identifies him as Hebrew. I believe there's only 3 ways. At that particular time, most males were shaved bald in the Egyptian, especially if they were the Cohen, the priest, or royalty. And so it would have been by his hairstyle, it would have been either by his clothing, or she may have looked at him and seen, well, he's been circumcised like a Hebrew. Am I right? I believe that Hebrews and Egyptians probably had similar skin tone, and so she couldn't say, oh, he's white. Well, you know, Moshe would have been white. About 5'8", short white spiked hair. I can't prove this, but I believe that in order to preserve Moshe's life and go back, it was strategic where she releases him. She releases him in a specific area outside Pharaoh's house where Pharaoh's daughter comes down to the river Nile to wash herself. And so what she does as an act of self-preservation and desperation, I believe that his parents more than likely circumcised Moshe like an Egyptian rather than a Hebrew, satisfying the need for circumcision, but not completely. Was Moshe circumcised, really? And if so, how? There is empirical data, in my opinion, that leads to me to believe that Moshe was circumcised in the manner of an Egyptian. Else he could never, it would have been a death penalty for the daughter of Pharaoh to contradict her daddy. Now, she could have hidden him if he'd had Hebraic clothes on. If he had been shaved bald, she could have, or had long hair, she could have shaved him bald. But if he had been circumcised like a Hebrew, you could not hide circumcision that way. Somebody would have snitched on Moshe with the ensuing next 40 years. Because they didn't have bathrooms with stalls. Go back and read what the King James English, it talks about males going out, standing and peeing against a wall. Somebody would have said, dude, yeah, who cut you? Now, I submit to you that it wasn't the circumcision. I believe that he'd been intentionally circumcised as an Egyptian. Why? Listen to what takes place. And I believe that what you're about to see in Exodus chapter 3, verse 5, he's going right back to Mount Sinai. This is Moshe at the burning bush, right? I believe he's at Mount Sinai. I believe he's in the location called the Garden of Eden. And I believe just like Adam would have been circumcised, I believe that Moshe is a shadow picture of Adam as well, and also Mashiach. Both of them are typology that are interchangeable. And in Exodus chapter 3, verse 5, Yahweh is speaking to Moshe, and he says, don't come closer. Don't come up here. Put your shoes off from off your feet for the place whereon you stand is holy ground. Wait a second now. That particular area right there is where I'm approaching. I can't come there because that's holy ground. And so there's something about my feet that keeps me from coming here and standing on this holy ground. That's what you can deduce from that. Am I right? If you look at the phrase, put off thy shoes from off your feet, literally Moshe is being told to uncover his feet. when I read this, I'm thinking, wow, that's the same thing that happened with Ruth and Boaz. Ruth goes in to the threshing place. Boaz is covered. Ruth goes in and uncovers his feet. Now, wait just a second. She just didn't idly go by and say, ooh, look at that. He's got on some Nikes. You have to understand that the word for feet, regel, is also a euphemistic term for the male anatomy. Are you listening to me? Got quiet there for once. The text says, an angel of Yahweh appeared unto him. And if you go back and look at the Hebrew language, you look at the Hebrew word for angel, the word malach, it has the same Hebrew letters as the word mul for circumcision. And all you have to do, you don't have to change the letters, you just change the vowel points. And if you change the vowel points, instead of saying an angel appeared unto Yahweh, it literally could say, Vayera elav Muleka Yahweh, and Yahweh revealed his circumcision unto him. In other words, the way he had been previously circumcised ain't good enough. Are you hearing me? And I believe that what happens is that he uncovers his feet. I believe Moshe is literally circumcised either by himself or by Yahweh in that particular instance. And I am convinced that Moshe was in the very same locale as Abraham was when Abraham originally met the Melchizedek in the place called Emek Hamelech, the Valley of the Kings. And Emek Hamelech has a numeric value of 305, the same as the Hebrew word olah, which means foreskin. And so you could call this place the Valley of Circumcision as well. Why would Yahweh take Moshe to the Valley of Circumcision if it was not to deal with something that had not been dealt with before? The second time around. Let's look forward to another closely related passage. And you've probably read this before and never paid any attention to it. I doubt you would admit it. Joshua, that hurts, don't it? Joshua chapter 5, verse 2. At that time, listen, this is mind-staggering. At that time, Yahweh said unto Joshua, make thee sharp knives and circumcise again the children of Israel the second time. Those two statements are contradictory. Unless you're one of those individuals that believes, and I used to teach this, that the generation that came out of Egypt, I believe they would have been circumcised during the 3 days of darkness in preparation for the blood being applied to the doorpost. Once they come out and go into the wilderness, all of those that would have been born in the wilderness, I used to teach, were probably not circumcised. But was that true or not? Is it possible? Go back and look at the word for second. It's not the word sheni for second. It is shenit. And it actually is indicating an additional circumcision from what they currently had. And most scholars will agree that the Hebrew text does indicate a previous circumcision. And is it possible, hear me out, is it possible that the generation in the wilderness, that they could also have been circumcised as the Egyptians were? If they had not, if they'd been circumcised like the Hebrew, there ain't nothing left to circumcise the second time. And remember, they're being circumcised. Why? Because they entered into the land of Canaan on the 14th of Nisan. Well, the 10th of Nisan, they circumcised, and on the 14th was Passover. And so it's imperative for them to make the connection between Passover and circumcision. You follow me? Now, verse 5 seems to explain there in Joshua that none of them had been circumcised during the wilderness. And again, I used to teach this. But it's an established fact that the minority of the camp of Israel had previously longed to return to Egypt. And if that's the case, circumcising themselves after the Egyptians would have appeased their conscience regarding circumcision and yet satisfy their lust to return to Egypt. And even though that's hard for us to understand, The religious of Israel today are attempting to revert back to a golden calf system that includes animal bloodletting, whose roots are deep in Egypt, also known as Babylon. And in fact, I have quoted for you here in my notes an ancient commentator that says the Jews up until that point had retained some of the Egyptian customs. Now, we've looked at that and your mind's smoking. Let's go back now to where it looks as if the angel Yahweh is about to kill Moshe. Exodus chapter 4, verse 26 says, so he let him go. Then she said, a bloody husband thou art because of the circumcision. So she takes matters into her own hand. She is circumcising someone at that particular place and time. And she says, a bloody husband are you because of the circumcision. The King James English has circumcision, mullah, in the singular form. The Hebrew text reads la mulot, the circumcisions. In other words, what she said, you are a bloody husband to me because of the circumcisions. Why would she say circumcisions? Well, it's talking about two distinct cuttings. I believe she's making a reference to her son Gershom being circumcised like an Egyptian, and she has to fully circumcise him. But it had only been 3 days since Moshe had been circumcised, and I believe that would have also been a reference to the circumcision of Moshe at the same time. Y'all got me here? Can y'all hold on? Now, let me just reframe this again. History records an Egyptian form of circumcision as only making a dorsal incision. I know this may be delicate. Turn to your neighbor and tell them, you're grown, aren't you? A dorsal incision of the foreskin. So you wouldn't remove the foreskin. The Hebrews would completely remove it. They would just split it and it would just fold over the top. Okay? I'm convinced that when Joshua circumcises the children of Israel according to a Hebraic fashion, Yahweh tells him, now the reproach of Egypt was rolled away. You just did away with the reproach of Egypt. You just did away with the Egyptian circumcision, and it was rolled away. The phrase there, rolled, or the word rolled, is galuti, and it means to roll in a circle, to encircle, a ring or a cut in a circular fashion, and literally it's saying the circumcision is complete. The reproach of Egypt has been rolled away, and the circumcision is complete. I don't know if I believe that. Well, the Hebrew word there for reproach, chorpat, also can indicate the podinda, the male organ. Go back and look in Isaiah 47, verse 3. And the root of that word there is karaf, which means to pluck it off. And so it's literally indicating once again that they go in and they pluck off the foreskin according to the Hebrew fashion rather than that of the Egyptian. And another layer helps you to understand, and Brittany and I was in, this is a delicate situation. I'm over there, Brittany, come on, let's talk about circumcision for a minute. But do you remember when Moshe's trying to make excuses? Wait, I can't go and deal with Pharaoh because I got a thick tongue. I'm a slow speech. Do you know that the rabbis say that an individual who is not circumcised properly has a thick tongue and is slow of speech? And so it's my opinion, up to this point, that both Moshe and Gershom probably have been partially circumcised, similar to that of an Egyptian. And as a result, it seems as if Yahweh is going to confront Moshe. And if you look back at the text of Exodus 24, verse 24 through 26, it's puzzled scholars for centuries. You will not find anything remotely related to what I'm sharing with you this evening. All I can tell you is that it seems as if from the King James English that Yahweh is intent on killing Moshe. So was there something wrong with Moshe? Or was it Zipporah? Let me ask you a question. Based on the previous burning bush encounter, Moshe gets his commission, and setting aside all of your traditional bias, why would Yahweh now attempt to kill the newly commissioned deliverer of Israel? Did you have an answer? In addition, what would our perspective of the following events tell us about Zipporah? The sages tell us that she was almost a saint. In fact, from the time Moshe's commissioned, all that Moshe can do is spend his time as a divine mediator for the house of Israel, and so she's relegated to just giving up her husband. That's not true. If that was true, then every marriage today where you find an individual standing in an office would be broken, and we forget that the first ministry that I have been called to is to my wife. That supersedes my ministry here. And the ministry of the marriage to Zipporah would have superseded his commission or call to the nation of Israel. There are some scholars that say, well, she was such a virtuous woman, and they cite the connections with her and Mary. They ride on a donkey. Go back and look. Moshe puts his wife and 2 sons on a donkey. The King James English says that they stop at an inn. And clearly they both are virtuous. She was been married for 40 years. Are you listening to me? She was not a virgin. Are you following my point here? So let's go back and read Exodus chapter 4. Can y'all hold on for just a couple more minutes? And it came to pass, by the way, in the inn. Hold on a second. Have you ever stopped and asked yourself, what in the world is a hotel doing at Mount Sinai and Horeb? That's what it says. That's what it says. That it came to pass, by the way, in the inn, that Yahweh met him and sought to kill him. Then Zipporah took a sharp stone and cut off the foreskin of her son and cast it at his feet and said, surely a bloody husband thou art to me. And so he let him go. And then she repeats it. And I believe when she repeats it, it's indicating what kind of an attitude she has. You're a bloody husband because of the circumcisions. Now, I believe that what happened in Genesis 3 would have happened right here again. And I'm convinced that circumcision is a figurative example of one who's considered dead to the world or dead to the flesh. He becomes a shadow picture of our Messiah, Yeshua. So look back at the phrase, and it came to pass. That phrase the rabbis teach, which is first seen in Genesis chapter 4, verse 3, and it came to pass, Cain and Abel are told to bring a sacrifice. The sages teach that it's always associated with the timing of a moed, a holy convocation. And I believe that this would have been Passover at this particular time, and 3 days earlier, Moshe would have been circumcised. Okay? And so, as we continue to look, the phrase in the inn. In Hebrew, it's but malone. The bait indicates a preposition as in, inside, but it could also indicate a house. The numeric value of bah malone is 128, the same as the phrase or word chalatz, which means loins, the seat of virility. This is not an accident. He didn't just stop at an inn, a hotel, a restaurant. They stopped at the place that would have been the seat of the loins, the seat of the original place of procreation. The root word translated as in here is out of place considering the physical location, and many scholars believe it should have been translated as in the place of circumcision. And so, bah, or house, malone would have been indicating the house of circumcision. Now look at the word foreskin. She cuts off the foreskin. The word for foreskin here is orlah. And again, it's in the plural form here. Orlot, foreskins. The only way that you could have circumcision and have foreskins in a plural form is if it had been after an Egyptian ritual where the foreskin had been split into 2 pieces and the 2 distinct parts are now being removed. The phrase orlot has a value of 700, the same as the phrase kaptor, which means the top of a pillar or a crown, or kaporet, the covering lid of an ark that served as a propitiation or atonement. And those are related to circumcision, because circumcision is a shadow picture of removing this covering, giving access to full reconciliation, just like the middle wall of partition being removed. Now, remember, Moshe is a type of Yeshua. Am I right? By being circumcised, for all intents and purposes, he's being cut off from the world. He's dying for the nations. And I believe what's happened is that Yahweh is revealing to Zipporah that Moshe, who's in the third day of his circumcision, the third day is the worst of the three, and it's figurative of death, the sign of Jonah, 3 days, 3 nights. And I believe that Moshe had been circumcised again on behalf of Israel. Literally, he gives his life. He's cut off in the flesh, just like the ritual of Passover typifies on the doorposts of Israel. And anyone who is circumcised and inside the house is protected by that seal on the doorpost. And she understands that. And she remembers, because Midian, Jethro, had been taught about the Moedim. And so she remembers Gershom is also in need of salvation, and she responds the same way that the children of Israel did all the way back in Exodus during the 3 days of darkness. They circumcised themselves. And it follows immediately with the Passover, the death of the firstborn. What do? They placed the blood of the lamb on the doorpost. Isn't it interesting that the sages teach that they took the blood of the circumcision and mixed it with the lamb's blood and put it on the doorpost of their house? Is it possible that she takes the blood of the circumcision, because it says that she throws it at Moshe's feet? Again, that word feet is a euphemistic term for pudinda. She literally, in my opinion, she strikes Moshe in the loins with the blood of the circumcision. This way, and this way, fulfilling the ritual of Passover. And so, by doing so, listen to this. Is it possible that Zipporah is willing to acknowledge she'd been living with him for 40 years? She knows that he's prone to mistakes just like all of us are. If I came up tomorrow and told my wife that Yahweh has just told me I'm going to be the deliverer of Salem, Oregon, she'd be getting ready for a fight. We're going to get all our guns. We're going to do business. Is it possible that she felt like Moshe, as a type of Yeshua, would be seen as the deliverer of Israel from the standpoint of being sent out to overthrow the military government of Egypt or Rome, fulfilling the role of Mashiach ben David? That's what the Jews of Yeshua's day expected. They expected him to come and fulfill the role of Messiah ben David and overthrow the Roman government. What they didn't expect was for him to come as Mashiach ben Yosef. She could not reconcile the fact that Moshe, as a type of Yeshua, was going to have to die for the nation in the role of Mashiach ben Yosef. And so she sarcastically calls him a katan damin, a bloody husband. You know, that also can indicate a newborn circumcised son. Every circumcised son experiences a new birth, a born-again experience, which destroys the work of the flesh. This newborn son now redeems the house. And the plural form of that word damin, according to the rabbis, is always related to blood guiltiness. And so when she says katan damin, she's actually saying, you're going to be responsible for taking on the guiltiness, the blood guilt of the nation? You're a Messiah figure? And yet Moshe was a shadow picture of just that. And I'm convinced that it was testifying, the circumcision was testifying of Yeshua's blood and the redemptive work that was found mediated only by the Melchizedek priesthood. The Levitical sacrifice of animals could never atone and never reconcile the intent of a circumcised heart first of all, without a true circumcised heart. And that's why I believe Moshe divorces her. The same thing happened to Israel and Judah at the coming of Messiah. They had no problem, because go back and look at why Judas turned him in. Look at all of the zealots that were around him. They were wanting him to help overthrow the Roman government. not give his life for the nations. Because of her attitude, she's put away, and her children, the Gershom, become the outcasts, the exiled, and they're going to remain in exile until the Melchizedek priesthood is restored, and then she'll be brought back to Moshe Yeshua. First, she has to acknowledge Yeshua as shedding his blood and being cut off for the nations, and she then has to follow suit by her own heart being circumcised. Where did you get those wounds in your hands and your feet? I got those wounds in the house of my friends. Listen to me. The house of Israel and Judah in particular are going to have to acknowledge Yeshua and his blood as the only atoning mechanism for mankind. And if you follow this, you see that this is the same pattern. Yitro brings Zipporah to Mount Sinai to reconcile with Moshe. But the golden calf incident occurs, and it sets off the kingdom of priests for a season, and they become subjected to the Levitical priestly order. I hope that you can see how important that is for us in the days ahead. Hope you enjoyed this teaching. Shalom Aleichem. Woo-woo.